Right. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We are going to start the session on the informality, how to deal with the elephant in the room, and we're calling it elephant because a huge number of population, ILO estimates about 2 billion people are working in the informal economy. If you look at the number of enterprises, that is again a huge number. So this session is going to look at these particular challenges, that how can we ensure that UN guiding principles, other ILO standards are respected in those particular situations. How can we ensure there is a decent work in those particular situations? How can we move towards formalization of the informal economy? So all these are the questions that we're going to deal with in this particular session. We have a very distinguished and diverse set of panelists, and I'm going to introduce all of them in one go, and then invite one by one these panelists to make some interventions. After this first round of interventions from all the panelists, I would have some questions, hopefully from the chat, or there could be some questions and comments that may be done by the others. So I think that is something which will be happening very shortly. Technicians, we need to get the first speaker ready, and she is making that request. In fact, you can get the next 4 speakers live, please. So the first speaker is Ms. Marlese von Broembsen. She is a law program director of the Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing. And the question that I have for you is that you have worked with the informal sector associations and organizations. What challenges do you see in the informal sector to decent work in the supply chain of the big enterprises? In particular, I'm interested what challenges women face in those settings. You have the floor, Marlese. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for this invitation to speak on this panel. I wonder if I could just ask the technician while I make a quick introductory remark to enable me to share my screen. Because I wanted to show a very short little video. So I think a good place to start is to define what we mean by informal. The ILO say that their definition is that somebody is informal if they do not enjoy legal protection or social protection. And importantly, they say that if a worker does not enjoy de facto protection, so they differentiate between de jure, i.e. legal, and de facto, in fact. So an informal worker can be protected by law, but if the law is not enforced, they're de facto informal. In the context of supply chains, and I'm speaking particularly now today on garment supply chains, the first important point to make is there's informal work both inside factories and there's informal work outside factories. So in factories, that usually takes 2 forms, fixed-term contracts and casual workers who are paid by the piece. And then outside factories, there are a range of forms, but the occupational group that we work with as WIEGO are home workers. So these are mostly women, mostly from childbearing age up. In factories, often workers are very, very young, and they are working from home for global and domestic supply chains. They often contracted directly by the factory or through a contractor, and sometimes through a workshop. At WIEGO, we believe that informal workers should speak for themselves. And so in the spirit of that, I want to ask if I could share a video, which is an informal worker telling you herself what her challenges are.
I'm not sure if that is possible, but I would let technicians respond to that. But you can continue with your observations in the meantime. Thank you.
Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen now?
I am not able to see your screen. At least I'm not able to see it. I cannot say for others.
Okay, let's see. Sorry, this was organized beforehand. Just quickly, anyone? Sorry, let me try one more time.
to share a document, you have to open it in full screen, but I don't know if it's a document or video.
The video, the video.
Because for the video, I don't know if it works, but
it will work if you could just get me share the screen, because it's like a document.
okay.
Sorry,
So
you did actually
you have an icon, enable screen sharing.
So there it just says I need consent.
And in application window, select your video, maybe.
So it says
and
that I need
click on
consent.
share.
Yeah, it just says I need consent. Okay, I think I don't think it's working.
My suggestion would be to proceed if we are not able to figure out the technical sides of it, because all of us are learning these things and different platforms work differently.
Sure. Okay. I'm sorry about that, because it's very powerful to hear from a worker himself.
Oh, definitely. So, I would have loved to hear directly from those women. Definitely, no doubt about it. But if technology is not there to help us do that, then we have to move on, right? Sure. Thank you. I very much appreciate your flexibility. Thank you.
No problem. So the issues for informal workers, one can look at them in a kind of technical sense, then the more, and I'm going to do that very quickly in the hope that the video is still rescued. Otherwise, I'll give you a brief sort of summary of the video. So for home workers who work from home, one must remember that they're also carrying production costs, such as they're paying for electricity, they're paying for space, they're paying for the sewing machine, for example, or any of the equipment that they use. Their issues are the following. First, they're not recognized as workers. In most countries, there's no legal recognition at all. And so we've seen in the time of COVID, that means they have no social protection. Secondly, they have no contracts. So typically, the person will arrive with their bundle of what they need to be producing for the day, and it's just a piece of paper they sign on. Thirdly, well, there's no social protection. And I think most importantly to know that they are paid between a third and half of the minimum wage. So this is a factory's response to the pressure that they feel from brands and passing down costs and risks to workers. Home workers in particular take the hit on wages. In terms of what my video would have said, it's a woman who works in Bangkok, and she talks about the intensity of her work, how often when orders come in, she's under such pressure to produce the work so quickly that she sometimes works until 10 p.m. at night. And she talks about having bladder infections because she doesn't have time to go to the toilet. And I think this is important because one sometimes thinks that these pressures are only in factories and not at home. So just briefly to come back to a question specifically, what do women in particular face? I think I want to just mention three things. The first, as women, there's a fair amount of violence, both inside and outside factories, and that's not unique to just informal women. The second is the issue of childcare. So home workers want to work from home, and one of the reasons is that they're able to care for children. And then the third, I think, is a lack of voice. Women who work from home they have very little voice. They have very little voice in their day-to-day interactions with the contractors, but they also have very little voice in the chain because they don't know who they're producing for. Let me leave it at that.
I think that is excellent. So thank you for highlighting the challenges. I very much appreciate, and despite the technical glitch, for which my apologies, but hopefully let us see if we can play that video later, because we still have about 55 minutes in this session. So if we can make the technology work, let us see if that works. But now I would like to move on to the second speaker that we have, and the second speaker is Mr. Triranjan Radhakrishnan. He is the project coordinator, responsible supply chains and sustainable development, Oxfam India. So Tri, the question that I have for you is that you and your organization has worked with the informal workers in the agriculture sector in India, in particular in the sugarcane industry, in the tea sectors. So what is your experience? What are the findings that you would like to share in terms of the conditions of these workers and to what extent the businesses are respecting human rights in line with the UN guiding principles or the ILO standards in those informal settings. So if you can share with us the state of play on that. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thanks, Surya. This is a very, very packed question to start off, as my opening remarks. But also, it's really helpful to sort of set the stage for our conversations coming forward. And also, if I may add, I mean, I think the title of today's session, the elephant in the room, is so apt because this is something that has for long relegated to the margins of questions of economics, especially informal sector workers, and the pandemic has really sort of brought forth this question. It was something that could no longer be ignored. I'm sure we'll get into those, that specificities later in the conversation today. But just to sort of highlight, I mean, let me start with one of the most stark facts. That more than 90% of India's labor force is informal sector workers, and almost 95% of all women who work in India are also employed in the informal sector workers, as in the informal sector. So in terms of the stories of that that we talk about in informal sectors, these are not like stories from the underbelly. This is the entire core of the lived experience for people in South Asia, India, and many other parts of the world. You rightly said, I mean, most of our work at Oxfam India's business and human rights program is specifically towards in the agricultural commodity supply and value chains, specifically tea and sugar. And what we've seen is that, sugar, which is a commodity, I mean, India is the second largest producer of sugar in the world. And 80% of that sugar is consumed domestically. And the entire process, despite, and that's the irony here, that despite it being a very regulated sort of a commodity and a very regulated sector, government has very clear guidelines on pricing, how much to be produced, catchment areas, etc. The entire process from farm to mill is completely informal. There is, this is something that in one of the states, Uttar Pradesh, which is one of the most populous states in India, which is also the leading producer of sugar, what we see is that there is absolutely no social protection. There is absolutely no legal protection. All the things that Marlese just said, I mean, these are basically playing out in ground in situ. We also see a lot of cases, I mean, the way it's organized is that pairs, a man and a woman is a pair, and they together is a unit of sort of, of farm workers, agricultural workers, which also means that children are there. There's no childcare. So obviously children are also with their parents in the field during the harvesting season, which has its own ideas, I mean, own problems and challenges. For example, there is no school, there is no basic facilities, you're pretty much on the field, 10, 12 hours of cane cutting. There are parts of the exercise, for example, loading sugarcane, massive bundles of sugarcane onto trucks. It's an extremely hazardous job. And there's also instance of child labor, and that's obvious to happen when children are in the field and there is no school, there's nothing else to do. They might as well, lend a hand. I mean, that's the understanding that, very poor, vulnerable, and marginalized communities come with that idea. The other thing that we often see in the sugarcane sector is, I mean, as I mentioned, because there is no legal protection, we end up seeing tremendous amounts of exploitation. Also, there is a sort of a connection between informality and sort of socioeconomic conditions. I mean, in India, we clearly see that the bulk of informal sector workers are also those from the most marginalized sections of the community. So, I mean, this is a very, very sort of, ingrained kind of a process where tremendous amounts of opacity. I mean, there's hardly anything which is transparent in this. So that's the kind of sugar work. In the tea is very similar. I mean, tea is in Assam. We work in Assam, especially in the tea growing plantations. And there we in fact are seeing an increasing informalization of the work. I mean, there are permanent workers, but more than around 50% of the workers who are in the tea plantations are informal sector workers, they're temporary workers. And that number can reach up to 75% during the peak harvesting seasons. Again, you're living in a tea plantation. This is acres of tea plantations. So that's where you live, that's where you work, that's where you stay. And the same issues, no schools, terrible housing facilities, especially for the informal workers, who are not the permanent workers. There's no sick leave, there is no health facilities, there's no education facilities. So it's basically, completely outside the ambit of, legal and social protections. It's almost like on the margins and basically dropping off the map. The other thing that we see as increasing informalization we see is that, the way informal workers are seen, they in the Assam tea plantation, they're called faltu workers. And faltu, the word in many parts of India, it means useless. And that's the irony. I mean, considering that 75% of these workers will be employed during the peak harvesting seasons, they're still considered to be faltu. And I think that's what sort of seeps into how they're dealt with, what kind of facilities they're given. And I mean, we can get deeper into this, but let me touch a little bit about the second part of the question that you asked, Surya, about, what are companies doing? As I said, sugar is India's second largest producing country of sugar after Brazil, and 80% of the sugar is for domestic consumption. And 70% of that production, entire annual production, goes to business. It's not business to customers. So in that case, I mean, we know what kind of role companies can play, and I mean, I think it would be rather not generous if I said that companies aren't doing anything. There is a lot of conversation that's happening. I mean, Oxfam has been part of this massive campaign since 2013 called Behind the Brand, which looks at the big 10 food and beverage companies. And there has been considerable movement towards, improvements of human rights conditions and other sort of business and human rights related issues. But unfortunately, that same commitment, which often one sees at the global level with these big companies, we don't quite see them in the subsidiaries of their operations in India and South Asia. I mean, a prime example is that we do an annual India Responsible Business benchmark where we looked at the top 500 listed companies, and I'm talking about disclosures, and this is just at the level of disclosures. The quality and the quantity of disclosures of what companies are doing on human rights, on due diligence, on other sort of environmental issues is just hardly there. I mean, none of the companies that we sort of looked at don't even reach the 50% mark of what would otherwise be considered as decent levels of transparency and proactive disclosure of information. Yeah, so I mean, in short, Surya, my answer was to that second question is that at best there is some improvements, but a lot needs to be done. But actually, the way we see it on ground is that we just don't know if companies are doing enough because there is hardly any disclosure. That's all from me now.
Thank you very much, Sri, for highlighting these issues and challenges in the context of informal economy in different sectors. So Marlese highlighted the garment sector, for instance, and you highlighted about two different industries in the agriculture sector in different countries as well. So this is definitely a big issue across, especially in the global south, but across the world, I would say. So let us now move on to the next speaker, and the next speaker is Vic Van Wuren, and glad to see you, Vic, virtually. We used to meet in Geneva, but because of the COVID, we are not able to meet. So the question, Vic is the director of the enterprise department in the International Labour Organization. And Vic, the question that I have for you is that what should states do to overcome the challenges that have been shared by the two panelists in terms of challenges to decent work in the informal economy, and what is the progress we have been making in terms of transitions to the formality? Vic, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and hi everyone. The opening caption of the discussion is about the elephant in the room. In Africa we have a saying that how do you eat an elephant? It goes piece by piece. And this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a huge challenge. And I don't believe that we give enough attention to the debate on informality, given the size of what we're talking about. At the global level, as been mentioned, we have 6 out of 10 workers are in the informal sector. That's 2 billion people. 1.6 billion have been affected negatively by COVID. 8 to 10 enterprises are out of 10 enterprises are informal. So COVID now has caused further hardship. It's pushed back some of the gains that we've made, and there's been this huge loss of jobs. So the concern for the ILO is this continual decent work deficit with the lack of social protection, safety and health. And yes, it's now for the states to take the lead, if they haven't already done this, to provide that enabling environment that will allow for businesses to become formalized. I think we need to recognize that in the world of informality, it's not just all small enterprises. It's people that are there out of necessity. It's entrepreneurs of necessity selling sweets on a street corner just to survive. But we also have those that are informal enterprises of opportunity that can be moved to become formal enterprises if the right climate is put in place. The question you asked is, are we making headway? I believe we've made small gains, but we're not making significant headway in getting a more formal economy in many parts of the world, particularly in the developing world. In order to move into this space, as I mentioned, we need to have this regulatory framework that will bring about effective enterprise formalization. These initiatives must be based on a coherent and balanced mix of laws, policies, strategies, and support programs. And this must be well coordinated, as the issue of formalization spans across many ministries and not just one single ministry in a country. And so we're looking at this integrated approach, which needs to be upped at the moment because we're not finding that in the developing world. A transition to formality takes time. We cannot walk into a country with a program and expect within 3 to 5 years you're going to formalize the economy. It doesn't happen like that. This is a long journey that we have to embark on, but we need to have the foundation in place that's going to create this regulatory framework that provides education, access to finance. And the next point I want to make is perhaps for me the most important one in our current climate, and that is that we need to incentivize people to move into the formal sector. At the moment, there's this line drawn in the sand that you think on one day you're informal and the next day you can just sign up and become formal. It doesn't work like that. There's this gradual progression of finding the informal sector enterprises that have got the makeup to move progressively into a more formal situation and then playing a more active role in the economic growth. And that's where the value chains and the companies, the multinationals, can play certainly an assisting role in this process. But the starting point and the foundation has to be created by governments. In relation to business and human rights agenda, which is very relevant for today's discussion, we have in the ILO reviewed our multinational declaration on where they've included a paragraph on informality. And this supports the ILO recommendation 204, which is a transition from the informal to the formal economy recommendation 204 adopted in 2015. And here it says government should develop and implement an integrated policy framework to facilitate the transition to the formal economy, recognizing that decent work deficits are most pronounced in the informal economy. And so if we look at the global picture, we'll find that we have at the moment pockets of excellence. And we need to learn and build on those pockets of excellence. And that's what we try and do from a knowledge platform, is to find out who is getting the success that we require. And then we need to scale up the activities. But governments, as I said in the beginning, have to take on the initiative, because companies can only operate in a formal space if there's that enabling environment, which has those key elements of education and access to finance that I've referred to. So in the years to come, the focus of the ILO will be about how do we deal with these decent work deficits? How do we look at social protection and safety and health? And we certainly be working in collaboration with the many players that are on your chat today, that we can work with them, alongside them, in looking at how we can make an impact in moving more people into the formal economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vic, and thank you for highlighting that we have not paid enough attention to this issue. And I think I would admit that even at the UN forum, this is the 9th UN forum, I recall this is the first session in which we are giving a dedicated attention to the issue of informal economy. So I think your point is well taken. And I hope going forward, not just us, but all the players and in all the events can pay greater attention to this issue of informal economy. So I think thank you for highlighting that. And I will come back to your point about pocket of excellence. If you could unpack some of those ideas later on. So I'll come back to you in the second round on that. But now I would like to move on to the next panelist. And before I move on to the next panelist, I would also like to invite the audience. If they have any questions, please ask the questions. And I'm going to raise those questions to the experts that we have here. So please feel free to ask any questions, any comments, any suggestions that you may have. So I very much welcome those. So the next speaker that I would like to invite is Madam Innocence Netep Ndie, and she is the President of High Council of Social Dialogue in Senegal. So Madam Innocence, you have the floor now. I understand she will speak in French, but interpretation should be available. Madam, you have the floor.
Oui, bonjour.
Yes, good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, madam, we can hear you. Please go ahead. Madam, can you try to speak? Because I think, madam, you need to be closer to the microphone, please. Yes, closer to the microphone. The interpreters can...
Le pouvoir public.
Sound is not reaching the interpreters.
Madam, your sound is not reaching the interpreters because we need...
You don't understand?
So if you can speak closer to the microphone, please. Thank you.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
I don't know what the issue is, but I don't see
You
that
hear
Madam
me
Innocence...
now? Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. No. Mute audio. Pardon. Réagir. Il y a un problème là.
I think we are having some issues about the quality of the voice quality that we're getting. It's not good enough for the interpreters, it seems. Let us try it again later on, but if the technicians could put the next speaker, Laureen Sibanda, on live, I'm going to turn to Laureen if that is possible. And in the meantime, we can see if Madam Innocence can work out the technical issues in terms of the sound quality. So it seems even Laureen is is not available. What about Douglas Opio? Because we have another speaker, Douglas Opio. Is Douglas able to join us now? Otherwise, I have questions for the panelists who are with us. Okay, what I will do is, I do not see the remaining speakers able to join us for whatever reasons, technical issues or other issues. So I would not like to waste any more time and have this conversation going, because we at least have 3 panelists here. And so I would like to go back to Marlese. Marlese, I see that you would like to react to what Vic mentioned. So if the technicians could give all 3 speakers, make them live now, please. All 3 speakers, make them live, please. Thank you. And Marlese, you have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Vic, that was a very interesting presentation. And I wanted to pick up on just 2 things. So the one is that globally, on the ILO statistics, the 2018 men and women in informal economy, which has statistics of over 100 countries, only 3% of informal workers have enterprises that employ anyone else. So 97% of the informal economy consists of either own account workers, which is the majority, so it's a person on their own, or otherwise it's the kind of informal work that I described earlier, so casual work, contract work, home workers, family workers, etc. And I think there's, he mentioned the ILO recommendation 204, the instrument that's about transitioning from the informal to the formal economy. And I think, that is very, very exciting, because it thinks about regulation very differently. So in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and I know Lorraine Sobanda is going to be speaking soon, 1 in 4 informal workers is a street vendor. And yet the regulatory environment throughout the world is very, very hostile to street vendors. Because what do they need? They need space to trade. And they need basic infrastructure like bathrooms to go to. And the ILO recommendation 204 instrument says that formalizing is giving workers and economic units legal and social protection first. Second, it talks about access to space. At third, it talks about collective bargaining rights. And in the context of South Africa, this has gone some way. We actually have a legal reform subcommittee which is looking at the Labour Relations Act and specifically recognizing the organizations that informal workers belong to, that they have the same kind of trade union status, and that their collective bargaining partner in that case is the local authority. So maybe if I can just say one other thing, which is what has been so interesting in the time of COVID. So the law program at WIEGO has analyzed the COVID sort of movement-related laws in 51 countries in Africa. In the first stage, 18 countries recognized that informal traders, particularly those selling food, are essential services, and had to begin to think about, well, how do you respond to that? By the next stage of COVID, so we've collected laws in 2 phases. 80% of countries have recognized that informal traders are essential services. And yet, the regulatory environment is so hostile. So I guess it's a conversation we need to have when we think about regulation, what kind of regulation we mean. And often, that regulation is at a national level around collective bargaining, and that's changing labor law. But the regulation that most often affects the majority of informal workers, waste pickers, street vendors, newspaper sellers, are workers who need access to public space. And there the regulation is at the local authority level.
Thank you, Marlese, for that. I understand that Laureen has been able to join now, but before we go back to Laureen, I would like to bring in Tree, because he wants to react to also what Vic said earlier. So if we can get Tree live, please, and then I will ask Vic to respond to what both Marlese and Tree have said, and then I will come back to Laureen and I'll continue with the discussion. So can we have Tree, please, now?
I hope I'm audible now. Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead. Your brief reaction, not very long, brief, please. Thank you.
Sure. I think what Vic said was a very, very pertinent point, that the governments have to create the starting point for formalization, which then the companies and corporations, MNCs, can actually take up and be the kind of standard bearers. But unfortunately, that is not how it's happening. I mean, we understand. I mean, that is a very logical way. I mean, that's why we think of UNGP 1 as state, UNGP Pillar 2 as the responsibility of companies. But I think this is also a bit of a vicious circle where the government and state is trying to woo the private sector and corporations by easing the ease of doing business. I mean, it's become one of the most coveted indices. I mean, much more coveted than HDI these days. So in a situation like that, where the government also considers labor, especially informal labor, as simply a factor of production or a necessary evil, where you're trying to sort of strip down labor laws and try make them into very simplified labor codes. I don't think that process is going to help for companies to really pick up the stick on how to deal with informal sector workers, when the government itself is not only not taking a step forward but actually taking 2 steps back. That's just my brief comment for now.
Tree, Vic, if you would like to react or respond to both the points made by Tree and as Marlese, you have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that we need to recognize that we need to analyze the nature of the informal sector in the respective countries, because some it's as high as 80% and some it's a lot lower. But what we need to understand is that the small business units are where formal job creation will take place. So the more one can bring small informal businesses or entrepreneurs into the mainstream of the economy, the better it will be for job creation and for a decent work agenda to be achieved. But as has been pointed out, that is often a very small component of the informal sector that is ready to be able to move into that space. But that is a very key component that needs to be focused on. However, the education and creativity, that there are a number of other angles that government need to take. Many people are in the informal sector because they don't have a skill set that can be used where there is a gap in the market. And so one needs to look at an education system, providing the space, I would agree, and providing a regulatory framework that is very flexible to adjust to the situation of the self-employed and the individuals that are trying to find some decent space to do some work. So yes, government has to work across ministries, but I come back to the point that governments are the ones that have to set this in motion. The private sector can play a role, but certainly cannot take on the responsibility of formalizing the informal sector, because that component of enterprises that are playing in that space is such a small component of the bigger informal picture. And that's where other elements of government programs have to kick in. But what we don't have is a correct information of what we're dealing with. And when you talked about a pocket of excellence, in the one country we worked with, we set up a database with an incentive to get people to come and register and to indicate what they were busy doing, so that one could analyze what the depth and breadth of the informal sector was. And this is by saying to people, for example, if you come and put your name on the table and say what you're doing, we will give you some training and we'll help you set up a bank account. If you come in and you register with a business plan and something else, we might give you a... And slowly, creep by creep, you get the person into the arena when they eventually have full participation, where they can provide some kind of tax payments and what we would like to see to increase the government fiscus. So let me stop there. I think there's many areas we can discuss, but I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. It's going to have to be customized according to country by country in terms of what the size of what they're dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you, Vic. I think it's a fair point that one size may not fit all, and we may need to do the country-specific analysis of the informal economy and then look at the solutions, and the range of solutions may be needed then, which are tailor-made. Now let us see if we could get Laureen live, because I would like to invite her to share. I somehow also heard in Thai the video being played in the background, so I don't know if that video is now able to be shared. But more than the video, I would like the next panelist to speak now. So if the technicians can work it out, if Laureen could be live, please now. Laureen, if you can hear us, there is an advice for you that you can click on F5 and then the technician should be able to connect you. I'm relaying this message. And in the meantime, I'm using the time to request the audience, if you have any questions. I haven't received any questions from the audience. So please, if you have any questions and comments to any of the panelists specifically or broadly to anyone, please make those questions to us in the chat box, and hopefully those questions will reach me, and I'm going to pick some of those questions. Okay, there is a question that I've seen now, that can you tell us something about the link between the informal sector and the modern slavery, please? Who would like to take a go at this? Vic, I see you. I see Tree as well as Marlese. I see Tree has raised the hand. So there are two volunteers. So I start in the same order. Tree first. Oh, all three. Okay. So everyone is very keen. That's excellent. So 1 minute each, starting with all three of you. Tree, and then Marlese, and then Vic. But 1 minute each, please.
Thanks, Surya. I think the link, one of the foremost link, is what today's conversation started with by Marlese, when she said that being outside legal and social protection. I think the moment you're outside all forms of legal protection, and often informal sector workers not only don't have legal protection, but they're also undocumented. They don't have a legal identity, so they're kind of doubly outside the realms. But also what we've seen more recently, especially in the case of COVID, is that when you don't have access to formal structures, you have to find these informal ways of making things happen for you. I mean, one of the best examples is credit. I mean, the amount of indebtedness that is rampant through informal sector workers in India and many other parts of this part of the world is astonishing. And well, actually it's not astonishing, because of course this is going to happen when you have to rely on these informal structures, because there's no access. And what we see is that with the COVID, with the lockdown that happened, there was no wages. People had to borrow from local money lenders, and we will probably see a spike in the rate of indebtedness, and in terms of what is in India we call bonded labor, essentially modern slavery.
I will stop you at that example of potential bonded labor going up. Tree, thank you very much. Marlese, I would like to give you the floor very briefly, if you can draw on that connection between informal economy and modern slavery, and then finally Vic. Thank you.
Just two things. One is just to say informal sectors, really just we're talking about enterprises. So when we're talking about modern slavery, certainly when I'm talking about it now, it would be in the context of global supply chains. So it would be people who are part of the informal economy, but not part of the informal sector, because they're working for the formal economy. They're informal and informal economy. I think if I can push back a little bit in terms of the last speaker, I think we've got to be quite careful when we use the term modern slavery, because I mean, there are 22 legal instruments that define what modern slavery is. And the reason I say this is recently there was a big report put out, and we were contacted by the BBC saying that home workers are a form of modern slavery. And the danger is that then, in the context of supply chains, multinational organizations, the brands, the buyers, will simply say, well, we're not going to authorize having home workers in supply chains. And what we try to say, no, this is lack of decent work. That's very different to slavery. I mean, slavery is where you don't have a choice whether you work or not. And the instruments that set out exactly what that is. So I guess that's really all I wanted to say, is that I think we must be careful how we use it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for highlighting that issue. Vic, you have the floor, and then we will going to try to have Laureen, if possible, after Vic. Thank you, Vic.
I think there's a direct connection between modern day slavery and the informal sector. In today's times, there's a desperation, people are vulnerable, and people are finding that they get into a situation that maybe not start out in a form of or definition of slavery, but they then get caught up into a process that leads to some form of definition of slavery. So we have to have zero tolerance for this, but the fact is that we cannot ignore that it's happening, and it's increasing when we find the situation of the global economy in such a turmoil at the moment that people are desperate just to survive. And that means they will do such crazy things and find themselves sometimes in a situation that can be defined as modern day slavery. So yes, there's a link.
Thank you, Vic. Now, is Laureen able to join? I think we are still struggling, it seems. If we are still struggling to get Laureen back, I see her live, but I don't see her video visible to me, at least. Then I will request Maria to play the video.
สมมติ8 ชั่วโมงอย่างเงี้ยเราก็ทำงาน8 ชั่วโมงเช้าใช่ไหมคะเราก็เริ่มงานตั้งแต่7 โมงถ้าเราขยันหน่อยก็6 โมงบางวันก็ตี 5แล้วเราก็เลิกงานประมาณสัก3 ทุ่ม 4 ทุ่มประมาณนี้ค่ะเราก็อยู่ในเบรกของเราในแมทของเราเองถ้างานเร่งหน่อยก็5 ทุ่มเป็นบางวันส่วนมากหนูจะทำคนเดียวค่ะส่วนใหญ่เลยนะถ้าตีเฉลี่ยอย่างอยู่คนเดียวอย่างเงี้ยคุณหาเงินไว้เลยจ่ายค่าห้องค่าอยู่ค่ากินของเราเนี่ย 7,000 บาทก็จะบีบให้ได้50 ตัวค่ะต่อวันเพราะเรามีเป้าหมายไงถ้ามาทำอยู่ที่25 ตัวมันไม่ได้กินอะไรค่าไฟเราก็ไม่คุ้มมันไม่คุ้มหลายอย่างบางทีปวดชิ้นฉงเดี๋ยวอีก2 ตัวป่ะอีกตัวนึงป่ะเดี๋ยวเร่งก่อนอะไรเงี้ยบางทีมันก็ลืมไปเลยพอลืมไปว่ามันเริ่มใหม่แล้วพอเราไปปัสสาวะมันก็ทีละนิดมันเราไม่เราปวดท้องพอปวดท้องขึ้นมาปั๊บก็กระเพาะอักเสบต้องกินยาละแต่ทุกวันนี้พูดตรงๆนะมันเหมือนมันงานรับอย่างเงี้ยเขาจะบีบราคาเรามากที่สุดบางทีเขาบอกว่าโอ้คุณได้มาแค่นี้ผมได้แค่2 บาทเองผมให้คุณเท่านี้นะอะไรเงี้ยบางทีเอาวะช่วยกันสนิทกันก็ต้องช่วยกันอะไร
I think that was the video that was being played. So I don't know if listen to that video that was about a woman worker in the informal economy in Thailand, and she was explaining her condition in terms of what kind of situations she's facing in terms of stitching clothes. So that was that. Do we have Miss Innocence or Ms. Laureen available now to take the floor, please? That is a question both for the speakers as well as technicians. And if for some reason they are not able to join, then I would like to continue the discussion with the current 3 speakers, because I need guidance from technicians on that, or the Office of the High Commission team in Geneva. Because if you are struggling to get the rest of the panelists online, I would like to continue the discussion with the 3 panelists who are able to join. And once again, request to the audience, that if you have any questions and comments, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and those questions I'm going to ask the panelists that we have. We were also hoping to get a representative of the employers, Mr. Douglas Opio. I don't know if Douglas Opio is able to join. Now we have another question, that how has informal economy been affected by the internet and independent contractor jobs like hire car drivers? Let me put it like gig economy. Do your organizations focus on online aspects? So not all three, but who would like to go for this? The relationship of informal economy and internet. Vic, do you want to take that part of the question? Informal economy and the internet?
Yes, I think we need to recognize that the future of work is very different to that which has been over the past years, and technology and digitization is certainly going to change the landscape. On the one side, it could cause a loss of jobs, but as I come back to my one point that I raised about educating and preparing people for the future markets, the actual internet itself may lend itself to some kind of informal employment where people fly below the radar screen and are not part of a registered business process. But that's where, as I said, each government will have to define and see how they regulate that particular arena. But I do believe that the informal sector will be impacted upon by the internet and digitization. But on the positive side, we can use this to make entry into the informal sector. We've got a project that will be starting soon called digital wage payments. And so what we're looking at is, even in the areas where there's no internet, is to use the mobile phone to find out how we can enable people in the informal sector to engage in business transactions. These are things that will certainly make it easier to formalize the informal sector and using modern day technology. So I think, to sum up, it's got a negative impact on the one side where it could cause more hardship, but on the other side, it's a huge opportunity that can make a positive impact if we manage it carefully and roll it out into the informal sector, which will be an enabling space for them. Thank you.
Thanks, Vic. We got one more question in the chat now from Maria. Posted that question kindly. Thank you, Maria, for that. Often laws introduce certain standards to informal sectors, but these are not enforced. So how can companies and civil society help governments with this? That is a question that we got from audience. And there is another broad question that I would like to pose to anyone, and Tree, you're most welcome to jump in to answer that question as well, but I will invite Vic and Marlese as well later. And my question is, if you're talking about such a big numbers here, and Vic already mentioned the journey, it will not happen overnight, it may not happen even a couple of years. So are we going to wait for this entire informal economy to turn formal? And my worry is that even if we make it formal, are we sure, are we confident that we are going to fix the challenges of decent work? Because we have the formal economy, and that is what we have been talking about for many decades, and there are labor rights issues there as well. So is formalization a magic bullet? Or should we also look at a number of approaches? And I think that may be a provocative question for ILO, but I wanted to bring this question on the table rather than putting this under the carpet. But Tree, if you can answer the first question from the audience, and then this very broad question for all three of you, whoever would like to respond. Thank you.
Thanks, Surya. And I think this is kind of a question that everyone, almost in most parts of the world, deals with, or sort of has to tackle with. There is kind of often a benchmarking, especially in countries in the global south. It's always relegated that the laws are there, but implementation is the key issue. But I think there are ways to go about it. I mean, there is something to be said about state capacities and state penetration, which often isn't quite the case, and especially in the case of in the informal economy, where a lot remains undocumented, a lot remains under the radar and extremely opaque. But I think this is where companies have a leverage point to sort of use and make things happen. It's not always that the legal standard is the one that you have to rise up to. but it can also be more proactive approaches. And I think we see that a lot now, and this is what I was referring to in my opening remarks, that the companies are doing. To say that they aren't is unfair. But what we see increasingly is that, companies are sort of, establishing the benchmark primarily on environment, ecology, and climate change issues. In that whole framework of ESG, E gets a lot of attention, S gets completely lost by the wayside. And I think that's where the need is, that companies need to start thinking about how can they start dealing with the S factor, the social factor, questions of inequality, questions of discrimination and vulnerability. These needn't always come from the state, as guidelines. I think one way to do that would be through increasing transparency, through increasing, how deep you want to look into your supply chains. Yeah, I think that's it.
Probably. Okay, probably we can pause here for Tree and then come back to you later. Marlese, I don't know if you would like to react to the broad question that I did throw to the entire panel, or if you have any other observations that you would like to make, because it seems now the other two panelists are somehow not able to join. So in the remaining 10 minutes or so, I'm going to have this discussion with all three of you. Thank you. You have the floor now.
Thank you. I think it's an incredibly important question. I think back to, so I'm a labor lawyer, and I think back to the heyday of labor law. It was about a social contract. These are questions of social contracts, the social contract between capital, labor, and the state. And so when we're talking about formalization, I don't think it's a technical thing. It's not just giving people skills or education or this is about social inclusion. It's what Tree was talking about, social inclusion in society. And I think that's why the ILO recommendation 204 is such an important step, particularly because it's a tripartite document. And informal workers participated in that process because it talks about legal protection and social protection. And those are the things, those are aspects, key aspects you need in order to be able to participate properly in society, including economically. Maybe I can just, I'm really sorry that the speakers from Africa couldn't speak, because I think some of the most innovative thinking is happening, particularly in Senegal, but also very bottom up in Zimbabwe. So maybe if I can give quick voice tip, not nearly in as good a way as they would have, but in Zimbabwe, where I think many of you have witnessed, there's such repression of citizens generally and of street vendors in particular. The street vendor movement from the bottom up have managed to be registered as trade unions, and they have now negotiated with a number of local authorities across the country for memorandums of understanding of an enabling, I guess, legal environment to trade. In Senegal, the informal workers, so this is specifically street vendors, have also been able to register as a trade union. And this has meant that they can take part in the tripartite structures that are discussions about the economy of the country and social policy in the country. And I think that's what we need to be thinking about. How do we bring people in so that all workers, including informal workers, have collective rights, have representation, are part of national conversations and global conversations about what a new social contract means, and in particularly post-COVID.
Thank you, Marlese. Vic, would you like to share any thoughts about any of the points made by the panelists or any questions?
I don't think there's this magic bullet that you can just formalize your informal sector overnight. Got to look at it two different levels. The one is a very pragmatic dealing with the people that are in the informal sector, trying to find a mechanism that will uplift their standards, that will provide them with social protection, that will provide them with the access to finance. And there is a certain modality that one's got to take care of. But on the longer term, one wants to try and get more economies from the developing space to move closer to the developed economy scenario. And there you've got to start looking at your your national strategies. You've got to look at your economic policy, your trade policy. You've got to look at your four capitals. How do you deal with people? How do you deal with society? How do you deal with your economic growth and the space for the private sector and the companies to flourish? And then you've got to look at the environmental component as well, which has got huge potential to create jobs. That is going to be the design that will bring people out of informality into the formal arena, because the jobs that will be created, the working environment will be far better in meeting the decent work agenda. But we're not naive in thinking that you can just take all of this overnight and make people happy and have the decent work agenda of the ILO implemented globally. We recognize that it's a creep process, that we need to look at innovative ways of dealing with informality and hardship in the different countries. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we're going to let go of our concept of a decent work agenda. We cannot accept work that brings about hardship. And some people say, well, any job is just a good job because they've got a job. We don't buy that argument. We need to start looking at the individual, the value of the human being, and the human-centered approach that the world is looking for. So yes, it's a very complicated but holistic approach. And what we'll do is work with governments to try and get their economies to function in a way that it creates more decent jobs, that takes people out of the informal sector. But at the same time, we'll work in the informal sector to see how we can improve those working and living conditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vic. It's unfortunate that Laureen is not able to join, but I understand she has shared something in the chat box, and I'm going to share her perspective as much as I could. And I'm going to read now. So one stark challenge, this is not me, this is Laureen, one of the panelists who was supposed to join us, is saying that one stark challenge which informal economy workers face is that of criminalization of informal economy. So there is this criminalization of informal economy activities, which in a sense are key sources of livelihood for these workers. In most countries, law enforcement agents continue to harass and violate informal economy workers whose workplaces are public spaces. These goods are confiscated and sometimes the workers are arrested. The harassment is enabled by the local authorities' approaches of beautification of cities, which does not offer alternative workplaces for informal workers. This beautification comes in the form of destruction and the demolition of informal workers' stalls or sheds. So I think this is really a big issue. I think I'm very glad that Laureen, you posted this in the chat box, because these are the real challenges that we are facing in different parts of the world. And the UN guiding principles say that all businesses of every type, anywhere, whether this is a solo business, I am running my own business as a family, I'm a tailor, and I just have a small machine to stitch clothes. There is no one employed, right? Even I have to ensure that I'm respecting rights of the people with whom I'm working, right? So how do we ensure that issue in that particular context? That becomes quite critical. I don't know if anyone of the two that I see, Marlese or Tree or Vic, would like to respond. I also see that someone is trying to get Madam Innocence able to share with us. Do you want to try Madam Innocence now? Madam, would you like
Oui,
to speak
je vais
now?
essayer
Let's
encore.
see if it works. Can you please try to speak, Madam?
Je vais. Oui, I'm trying to speak. Have you understand me?
Sorry?
Alors, je vais reprendre juste pour faire.
Can I just summarize about what I want to say? Can I perhaps just come in and summarize what I wanted to say?
I'm unfortunately not able to hear, but I would like to give
Yes.
Madam Innocence the floor now. We just have
Can you
2 or
understand?
3 minutes left, but you have the floor.
On attend pour vous.
Merci. Ce que je...
Thank you. What I wanted to say, well, I'll summarize it. Across all the discussions that I've heard, the role of governments and the role of workers. I am speaking. I say we've stressed on the role of the governments. In Senegal, the government has set up all structures, loads of structures which could help workers in the informal economy to become formalized. You've said that the governments need to work across the board. It's not just one single ministerial department, it's various ministerial departments. And today in Senegal, we've set up a framework, a coordination framework of all the different departments and services which might be brought in to assist the informal economy workers. We've got statistics. We know that these workers have a vast contribution to the economy of Senegal, but they're not protected in any way, shape or form, and that is where human rights come into play. In terms of the High Council for Social Dialogue, we've understood that it's a tripartite system and social dialogue which will promote the issue of formalizing enterprises and businesses. And what we've done is tripartite consultation with the different members so that we can be heard regarding promotion of the declaration of the tripartite principles for multinational enterprises and social policy together with the ILO. And I think if they're used properly in the right place with the right stakeholders, then things can happen. Without the right stakeholders on the ground, the government can't formalize anything. The workers themselves need to accept a formal framework where they can benefit and enjoy their rights. Otherwise, the multinationals will crush them. Now, we have identified multinationals where we have promoted the declaration because the declaration isn't CSR itself. That in and of itself is just the will of the employer. The High Council had to organize consultations to establish, together with the government, who the destinataries of the resources would be, for example, from mining and from gas exploitation. So we've really taken strides forward in Senegal here, and we do intend to move forward in the same way with really an inclusive approach, because you can't force workers or employers to abide by this if they don't want to. The debate is ongoing, and it's important so that in a country, I mean, I was following the examples from some of the speakers, and it's really important to ensure, I mean, if you look at many African countries, the informal sector is very highly developed, but there is a link that needs to be made, a bridge that needs to be built, and I think that the United Nations have done this when they've looked at this issue through a human rights lens. Workers have rights. They need to be protected. How can this be done? By formalizing these workers. There's also the issue of subcontracting, multinationals who subcontract things to other enterprises and the informal sector subsequently. That's not the proper way of proceeding.
Les marchés publics ont pour que
Madam, in a sense, I think we would need to now wrap up this session because the time is up.
Véritablement protéger.
My apologies that because of technical issues, we could not give you enough time to intervene. But I need to wind up this session, and I'm just going to add this observation from Laureen. She posted in the chat box that there is a great need for extension of social protection to informal workers, of which universal health care, maternity health care, quality and affordable child care health facilities for children. That is a suggestion. We could, of course, because of technical reasons, not get interventions from a couple of panelists. It seems that
et ce panel a été organisé aussi autour de la formalisation. Je pense que c'est ensemble que nous pouvons trouver les voies et moyens pour réduire de façon générale la pauvreté. Parce que quand on n'a pas de protection sociale, quand on n'a pas de retraite, on ne peut pas
Madam Sense, unfortunately, we have to wrap up this session now. My apologies that because of technical reasons, we could not give you enough time. My apologies to other panelists like Doreen as well. But thank you for the three panelists who could share their views. And I hope this session is a starting point and all the actors play a more critical role going forward. And of course, in addition to exploring the formalization goal, we also look at country-specific innovative solutions in the meantime, that how can we ensure that the labor rights and the human rights of the workers in the informal economy are protected, at least in the interim, if formalization is not achieved. So with these concluding remarks, I'm going to close the session. I would like to thank all the panelists and also the audience who have been waiting patiently for these technical glitches. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye for now.